All right, welcome. Today we're diving into a really fascinating idea. What if the economy isn't this chaotic, unpredictable thing? What if instead it's a perfectly designed, self-regulating machine? A system where every single part works in perfect harmony to keep itself stable, no driver needed at the wheel. Well, that's the core vision of classical macroeconomics.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start in the engine room and look at the quantity theory of money. That's what sets the prices. Then we'll check out the economy's internal gyroscope, the interest rates that keep it all balanced. We'll also see what happens when the government tries to, tinker with the machine. And finally, we'll wrap up with the big takeaways from this classical blueprint.
Really think about that question. What if the economy could just fix itself? This is the fundamental idea, the heartbeat of the classical model. The belief is that if you just leave it alone, the economy will naturally, on its own, find its way to full employment and total stability. It's a really powerful and, you could say, optimistic point of view.
Okay, so if the economy is this self-running machine, what's controlling all the price tags? How does it know what a loaf of bread or a new car should cost? Well, according to classical economists, there's a single powerful mechanism at work. So let's get into our first major component, the quantity theory of money.
Now, before we get to the theory itself, we have to understand this one key concept called the velocity of money. It sounds pretty technical, but it's actually super simple. Just picture a single dollar bill. How many times does that $1 get spent and respent in a year to buy actual goods and services? That speed, how fast it moves from wallet to wallet, that's its velocity.
And this is it. This simple-looking but incredibly powerful equation, mv equals py, is basically the engine room of the entire theory. It creates this direct link between the amount of money floating around in the economy and the total value of everything that economy produces. So let's break down what each of these letters actually mean.
Okay, so here's where the classical view makes a really bold claim. They argue that V, the velocity of money, is pretty stable because, our spending habits don't just change overnight. They also said that Y, the actual amount of stuff we can produce, is fixed in the short term by things like our factories and our workforce. Now, if you believe those two things are basically locked in place, it creates this direct, almost mechanical link between M, the money supply, and P, the overall price level.
And this leads us to the core and honestly kind of stunning conclusion of the whole theory. If you double the amount of money in the system, but the speed of spending and the amount of goods being produced stay the same, well, something's got to give, and that something is the price tags. You double the money, you double the prices. It's that direct.
The famous American economist Irving Fisher, he's the one who really hammered this home. He summed it up perfectly. For him, this wasn't just some loose idea. It was a fundamental law of economics, as direct and mechanical as a law of physics. More money means higher prices, period.
So the theory sounds pretty clean, right? But does it actually hold up in the messy real world? Well, let's put it to the test. Let's see what happens when a government decides to crank up the money printing machine. You'll see this equation can have some very real and sometimes devastating consequences.
Now, economists over at Cambridge University gave this a slightly different spin that I think really helps explain the why. It's all about human behavior. Imagine the government just starts handing out a ton of new cash. Suddenly, you and I, we have more money in our pockets than we really want to just hold on to. What's our first impulse? To spend it. But here's the catch. If the factories are already running at full capacity, they can't make more stuff. So all that new spending just ends up bidding up the prices for the same old amount of goods.
And listen, this isn't just some theoretical exercise. Just look at these numbers from periods of hyperinflation. The data is just stark. In places like Brazil and Peru, the insane growth in the money supply was almost perfectly mirrored by an absolute explosion in prices. We're talking a nearly one-to-one relationship. This is the quantity theory of money playing out in its most extreme and destructive form.
Okay, so we've seen how money pretty much just determines the price level. But what about the real side of the economy? The actual buying, selling, investing, building stuff. What keeps all of that stable? For that, we need to look at the machine's incredible internal balancing gyroscope, the interest rate.
Now, in the classical view, the interest rate isn't something the central bank just decides on. Nope, it's the natural price of borrowing money, and it's set in what's called the market for loanable funds. Think of it like any other market. On one side, you have the supply of funds, which comes from households like us saving our money. On the other side, you've got the demand for those funds, coming from firms who want to invest and from the government when it needs to borrow. The interest rate is just the price that makes supply equal demand.
And this is the truly beautiful part of this self-regulating machine.
Let's say businesses suddenly get pessimistic and they cut way back on their investment plans. Well, that reduces the demand for loans, right? So the interest rate naturally starts to fall, and that lower rate acts like a signal. It encourages other businesses to borrow and invest, and it tempts households to save a little less and spend a little more. The initial shock gets perfectly offset. The machine just rebalances itself, automatically.
So this machine seems to run perfectly fine all on its own. But what happens if an outside force, let's say the government, decides to jump in and try to help by increasing its own spending? Does that actually boost the economy, or does the machine just adjust?
Well, according to the classical model, the government's efforts are pretty much neutralized. Here's why. When the government borrows more money, it increases the total demand for funds in that loanable funds market. That pushes up the price of borrowing, the interest rate. And that higher interest rate makes it less attractive for private companies to invest and more attractive for households to save. So the increase in government spending is met by a decrease in private spending. It gets crowded out.
But wait, this doesn't mean all government policy is useless. The classical model says that while messing with demand is a waste of time, the government can have a real impact if it focuses on the supply side of the economy, specifically by changing our incentives to work and produce through tax policy.
So here's how that works. If you cut the marginal income tax rate, that's the tax you pay on an additional dollar you earn, you change the whole trade-off between working and, say, relaxing. When people get to keep more of each extra dollar they make, the incentive to work a little harder or take on an extra shift goes up. This can actually boost the total supply of labor, which leads to more employment and a genuine increase in the economy's total output.
Okay, so we've looked under the hood at all the different gears and levers of this classical machine. So what's the final blueprint? What are the core beliefs and the big policy ideas we should take away from this really elegant model of the economy? It all boils down to this really powerful idea called the classical dichotomy. It's this belief that the real economy and the money economy are two separate things. Real factors like technology, our resources, how much people want to work, those determine real outcomes, like how many jobs we have and how much stuff we produce. Money is just a veil that we drape over the real economy to determine the price tags. And the logical policy conclusion from all of this, if the machine fixes itself, the best thing the government can usually do is just get out of the way.
The classical model gives us this elegant, compelling vision of a perfectly self-correcting economic machine. But it also leaves us with the central question that economists have been fighting about ever since. Is the economy really this self-sufficient machine that runs best when you just leave it alone? Or are there times when it breaks down, when it falters, and it needs a skilled driver to take the wheel? That very question would set the stage for the next great revolution in economics.